Chapter 12. Tables of Differential Rent and Comment. Section 1. Changes in the amount and rate of rent. A further comment on the above. Supposing more productive or better situated coal mines and stone quarries were discovered, so that with the same quantity of labor, they yielded a larger product than the older ones, and indeed so large a product that it covered the entire demand. Then the value, and therefore the price of coal, stones, and timber would fall, and as a result the old coal mines and stone quarries would have to be closed. They would yield neither profit nor wages nor rent. Nevertheless, the new ones would yield rent just as the old ones did previously, although less, that is, at a lower rate. For every increase in the productivity of labor reduces the amount of capital laid out in wages in proportion to the constant capital, which is in this case laid out in tools. Is this correct? Does this also apply here, where the change in productivity of labor does not arise from a change in the method of production itself, but from the natural fertility of the coal mine or the stone quarry, or from their situations? One can only say here that in this case the same quantity of capital yields more tons of coal or stone, and that therefore each individual ton contains less labor. The total tonnage, however, contains as much as or even more labor if the new mines or quarries satisfy not only the old demand which was previously supplied by the old mines and quarries, but also an additional demand, and moreover an additional demand which is greater than the difference between the productivity of the old and that of the new mines and quarries. But this would not alter the organic composition of the capital employed. It would be true to say that the price of a ton, an individual ton, contained less rent, but only because altogether it contained less labor, hence also less wages and less profit. The proportion of the rate of rent to profit would, however, not be affected by this. Hence we can only say the following. If demand remains the same, if therefore the same quantity of coal and stone is to be produced as before, then less capital is employed now in the new richer mines and quarries than before in the old ones in order to produce the same mass of commodities. The total value of the latter thus falls, hence also the total amount of rent, profit, wages, and constant capital employed. But the proportions of rent and profit change no more than those of profit and wages, or of profit and the capital laid out, because there has been no organic change in the capital employed. Only the size and not the composition of the capital employed has changed, hence neither has the method of production. If there is an additional demand to be satisfied, an additional demand moreover that equals the difference in fertility between the new and the old mines and quarries, then the same amount of capital will be used now as previously. The value of the individual ton falls, but the total tonnage has the same value as before. As regards the individual ton, the size of the portions of value which resolve into profit and rent decreased together with the value it contained. But since the amount of capital has remained the same, and with it the total value of its product, and no organic change has taken place in its composition, the absolute amount of rent and profit has remained the same. If the additional demand is so great that with the same capital investment it is not covered by the difference in fertility between the new and the old mines and quarries, then additional capital will have to be employed in the new mines. In this case, provided the growth of the total capital invested is not accompanied by a change in the distribution of labor, the application of machinery, in other words, provided there is no change in the organic composition of the capital, the amount of rent and profit grows because the value of the total product grows, the value of the total tonnage, although the value of each individual ton falls, and therefore also that part of its value which resolves into rent and profit. In all these instances, there is no change in the rate of rent, because there is no change in the organic composition of the capital employed, however much its magnitude may alter. If, on the other hand, the change arose out of such a change, i.e. from a decrease in the amount of capital laid out in wages as compared with that laid out in machinery, etc., so that the method of production itself is altered, then the rate of rent would fall, because the difference between the value of the commodity and the cost price would have decreased. In the three cases considered above, this does not decrease. For though the value falls, the cost price of the individual commodity falls likewise, in that less labor is expended upon it, less paid and unpaid labor. Accordingly, therefore, when the greater productivity of labor, or the lower value of a certain measure of commodities produced, arises only from a change in the productivity of the natural elements, from the difference between the natural degree of fertility of soils, of mines, of quarries, etc., then the amount of rent may fall because, under the altered conditions, a lesser quantity of capital is employed, It may remain constant if there is an additional demand. It may grow if the additional demand is greater than the difference in productivity between the previously employed and the newly employed natural agencies. The rate of rent, however, could only grow with a change in the organic composition of the capital employed. Thus, the amount of rent does not necessarily fall if the worse soil, quarry, coal mine, etc. is abandoned. The rate of rent, moreover, can never fall if this abandoning is purely the result of lesser natural fertility. Ricardo distorts the correct idea that in this case, depending on the state of demand, the amount of rent may fall. In other words, depending on whether the amount of capital employed decreases, remains the same, or grows. He confuses it with the fundamentally wrong idea that the rate of rent must fall, which is an impossibility on the assumption made, since it has been assumed that no change in the organic composition of capital has taken place, therefore no change affecting the relationship between value and cost price, the only relationship that determines the rate of rent. Section 2. Various combinations of differential and absolute rent. Tables A, B, C, D, and E. But what happens to differential rents in this case? Supposing that 3 groups of coal mines were being worked, 1, 2, and 3. Of these, number 1 bore the absolute rent, number 2 a rent which was twice that of number 1, and number 3 a rent which was twice that of number 2, or 4 times that of number 1. In this example, number 1 bears the absolute rent R, number 2 bears 2R, and number 3 bears 4R. Now if number 4 is opened up, and if this is more productive than 1, 2, and 3, and if it is so extensive that the capital invested in it can be as great as that in 1, then in this case, the former state of demand remaining constant, the same amount of capital as was previously invested in number 1 would now be invested in number 4. Number 1 would thereupon be closed, and a part of the capital invested in number 2 would have to be withdrawn. Number 4 would suffice to replace number 1 and a part of number 2, but number 3 and number 4 would not suffice to supply the whole demand without part of number 2 continuing to be worked. Let us assume, for the sake of the illustration, that number 4, using the same amount of capital as was previously invested in number 1, is capable of providing the whole of the supply from number 1 and half of the supply from number 2. If, therefore, half the previous capital were invested in 2, the old capital in number 3 and the new in number 4, then the whole market would be supplied. What changes had taken place, or how would the changes accomplished affect the general rental, the rents of 1, 2, 3, and 4? The absolute rent derived from number 4 would in amount and rate be absolutely the same as that formerly derived from number 1. In fact, the absolute rent in amount and rate would also before have been the same on 1, 2, and 3, always supposing that the same amount of capital was employed in those different classes. The value of the produce of number 4 would be exactly identical to that formerly employed on number 1, because it is the produce of a capital of the same magnitude and of a capital of the same organic composition. Hence, the difference between the value of the product and its cost price must be the same, hence also the rate of rent. Besides, the amount of rent must be the same because at a given rate of rent, capitals of the same magnitude would have been employed. But since the market value of the coal is not determined by the individual value of the coal derived from number 4, it would bear an excess rent, or a surplus over its absolute rent. A rent derived not from any difference between value and cost price, but from the difference between the market value and the individual value of the produce of number 4. When we say that the absolute rent, or the difference between value and cost price on 1, 2, 3, and 4 is the same, provided the magnitude of the capital invested in them, and therefore the amount of rent with the given rate of rent is the same, then this is to be understood in the following way. The individual value of the coal from number 1 is higher than that of number 2, and that from number 2 is higher than that from number 3, because 1 ton from number 1 contains more labor than 1 ton from number 2, and 1 ton from number 2 more than 1 ton from number 3. But since the organic composition of the capital is in all 3 cases the same, this difference does not affect the individual absolute rent yielded by number 1, 2, and 3. For if the value of a ton from number 1 is greater, so is its cost price. It is only greater in the proportion that more capital of the same organic composition is employed for the production of 1 ton in number 1 than in number 2, and of 1 ton in number 2 than in number 3. This difference in their values is therefore exactly equal to the difference in their cost prices. In other words, to the difference in the relative amount of capital expended to produce 1 ton of coal in 1, 2, and 3. The variation in the magnitudes of value in the three groups does not, therefore, affect the difference between value and cost price in the various classes. If the value is greater, then the cost price is greater in the same proportion, for the value is only greater in proportion as more capital or labor is expended. Hence, the relation between value and cost price remains the same, and hence absolute rent is the same. But now let us go on to see what is the situation regarding differential rent. Firstly, less capital is now being employed in the entire production of coal in 2, 3, and 4. For the capital in number 4 is as great as the capital in number 1 had been. Furthermore, half the capital employed in number 2 is now withdrawn. The amount of rent on number 2, therefore, will at all events drop by a half. Only one change has taken place in capital investment, namely in number 2, because in number 4 the same amount of capital is invested as was previously invested in number 1. We have, moreover, assumed that capitals of the same size were invested in 1, 2, and 3, for example, £100 each, altogether £300. Now, therefore, only £250 are invested in 2, 3, and 4, or 1/6 of the capital has been withdrawn from the production of coal. Moreover, the market value of coal has fallen. We saw that number 1 yielded R, number 2 2R, and number 3 4R. Let us assume that the product of £100 on number 1 was £120, of which R equaled £10 and £10 equaled the profit. Then the market value of number 2 was £130, with £10 profit and £20 rent, and of number 3 £150, with £10 profit and £40 rent. If the product of number 1 was 60 tons, being £2 per ton, then that of number 2 was 65 tons, and that of number 3 was 75 tons, and the total production was 200 tons. Now, if 100 will produce as much in number 4 as the total product of number 1 and half of the product of number 2, namely 60 plus 32.5 being 92.5 tons, which, according to the old market value, would have cost £185, and since the profit was 10, would thus have yielded a rent of £75, amounting to 7 1/2 R, for the absolute rent equal £10. 2, 3, and 4 continue to yield the same number of tons, being 200. But what is the position now with regard to market value and differential rents? In order to answer this, we must see what is the amount of absolute individual rent of number 2. We assume that the absolute difference between value and cost price in this sphere of production equals £10, i.e. equals the rent yielded by the worst mine, although this is not necessary unless the market value is absolutely determined by the value of number 1. If this was indeed the case, then the rent on number 1, if the coal from number 1 were sold at its value, in fact represented the excess of value over its own cost price, and the general cost price of commodities in this sphere of production. Number 2, therefore, would be selling its products at their value if it sold its tonnage, being the 65 tons, at £120, i.e. the individual ton at 1 11/13 of a pound. That instead it sold them at £2 was only due to the excess of the market value, as determined by number 1, over its individual value. It was due to the excess not of its value, but of its market value over its cost price. Moreover, on the assumption made, number 2 now sells, instead of 65, only 32.5 tons, because a capital of only £50 instead of a capital of 100 is now invested in the mine. Number 2, therefore, now sells 32.5 tons at £60. £10 on 50, the capital advanced, is 20%. Of the £60, 5 are profit and 5 rent. Thus we have for number 2, the value of the product, 1 11/13 of a pound per ton. The number of tons is 32.5. The total value of the product is £60. Rent is £5. The rent has fallen from 20 to 5. If the same amount of capital were still employed, then it would only have fallen to £10. The rate has therefore only fallen by a half. That is, it has fallen by the total difference that existed between the market value as determined by number 1 and its own value. The difference, therefore, that existed over and above the difference between its own value and cost price. Its differential rent was £10. Its rent is now £10, equal to its absolute rent. In number 2, therefore, with the reduction of the market value to the value of coal from number 2, differential rent has disappeared, and consequently, also the increased rate of rent, which was doubled by this differential rent. Thus, it has been reduced from £20 to £10. With this given rate of rent, however, the rent has been further reduced from £10 to 5, because the capital invested in number 2 has fallen by a half. Since the market value is now determined by the value of number 2, i.e. by 1 11/13 pound per ton, the market value of the 75 tons produced by 3 is now 138 6/13 of a pound. of which 28 and 6/13 are rent. Previously, the rent was £40. It has therefore fallen by 11 and 7/13 of a pound. The difference between this rent and the absolute rent used to be £30. Now it only amounts to 18 and 6/13. Previously, it was 4R. Now it is only 2R plus 8.5 pounds. As the amount of capital invested in number 3 has remained the same, this fall is entirely due to the fall in the rate of differential rent, i.e. the fall in the excess of the market value of number 3 over its individual value. Previously, the whole of the rent in number 3 was equal to the excess of the higher market value over the price of production. Now it is only equal to the excess of the lower market value over the cost price. The difference is thus coming closer to the absolute rent of number 3. With a capital of £100, number 3 produces 75 tons, whose individual value is £120. 1 ton, therefore, is equal to 1 3/5 of a pound. But number 3 sold the ton at £2, the previous market price. Therefore, 2/5 of a pound more than its individual value. On 75 tons, this amounted to £30, and this was in fact the differential rent of number 3, for the rent was £40, being 10 for absolute, and 30 differential rent. Now, according to the new market value, the ton is sold at only 1 11/13 pounds. How much above its individual value is this? The price at which the ton is sold is 16/65 of a pound above its individual value. On 75 tons, this amounts to 18 6/13 of a pound, and this is exactly the differential rent, which is thus always equal to the number of tons multiplied by the excess of the market value of the ton over the individual value of the ton. It now remains to work out the fall in rent by 11 7/13 pounds. The excess of the market value over the value of number 3 has fallen from 2/5 of a pound per ton, when it was sold at £2, to 16/65 per ton. On 75 tons, this amounts to 11 7/13, and this is exactly the amount by which the rent in number 3 has fallen. The 92.5 tons from number 4, at 1 11/13 pounds per ton, cost 170 10/13 pounds. The rent here is 60 10/13 pounds, and the differential rent is 50 10/13. If the 92.5 tons were sold at their value, that is £120, then 1 ton would cost 1 11/37 of a pound. Instead, it is being sold at 1 11/13 pounds. This makes the excess of the market value of number 4 over its value equal to 264 over 481. On 92.5 tons, this amounts to exactly 50 10/13 pounds, which is the differential rent of number 4. Now let us put these two cases together under tables A and B. The aforementioned graphics will not be read aloud for the recording. Please consult Section 2 of Chapter 12 of a physical or digital copy of the book for visual reference. These two tables give rise to some very important considerations. First of all, we see that the amount of absolute rent rises or falls proportionately to the capital invested in agriculture, that is, to the total amount of capital invested in number 1, 2, and 3. The rate of this absolute rent is quite independent of the size of the capitals invested, for it does not depend on the difference in the various types of land, but is derived from the difference between value and cost price. This latter difference, however, is itself determined by the organic composition of the agricultural capital, by the method of production, and not by the land. In number 2b, the amount of the absolute rent falls from £10 to 5, because the capital has fallen from 100 to 50. Half the capital has been withdrawn from the land. Before making any further observations on the two tables, let us construct some other tables. We saw that in Table B, the market value fell to 1 11/13 pounds per ton. But let us assume that at this value, there is no necessity either for 1A to disappear completely from the market or for 2B to employ only half the previous capital. Since in number 1, the rent is £10 out of the total value of the commodity of 120, or 1/12 of the total value, this applies equally to the value of the individual ton, which is worth £2. The cost price of a ton from number 1 is thus £1 and 16 2/3 shillings. The new market value is £1 and 16 12/13 shillings. This would amount to a total rent of 15 5/13 shillings for 60 tons. Therefore, number 1 put less than 1% rent on the capital of 100. For 1A to yield no rent at all, the market value would have to fall to its cost price, namely to £1 and 16 2/3 shillings. In this case, the rent on 1A would have disappeared. It could, however, continue to be exploited with a profit of 10%. This would only cease if the market value were to fall further, below the cost price of £1.56. So far as 2B is concerned, it has been assumed in Table B that half of the capital is withdrawn. But since the market value of £1.11 still yields a rent of 10%, it will do so just as well on £100 as on 50. If, therefore, it is assumed that half the capital has been withdrawn, then only because, under these circumstances, 2B still yields an absolute rent of 10%. For if 2B had continued to produce 65 tons instead of 32.5, then the market would be oversupplied, and the market value of number 4, which dominates the market, would fall to such an extent that the capital investment in 2B would have to be reduced in order to yield the absolute rent. It is, however, clear that if the whole capital of £100 yields rent at 9%, the sum total is greater than that yielded by a capital of £50 at 10%. Thus, if according to the state of the market, a capital of only £50 were required in number 2 to satisfy the demand, the rent would have to be forced down to £5. It would in fact fall even lower if it is assumed that the 32.5 tons cannot always be disposed of, i.e. if they were thrown out of the market. The market value would fall so low that not only the rent on 2B would disappear, but the profit would also be affected. Then capital would be withdrawn in order to diminish supply until the correct point of £50 had been reached, and then the market value would have been re-established at £1.11, at which 2B would again yield the absolute rent, but only on half the capital previously invested in it. In this instance too, the whole process would emanate from 4 and 3, who dominate the market. But it does not by any means follow that if the market only absorbs 200 tons at £1.11 per ton, it will not absorb an additional 32.5 tons if the market value falls, i.e. if the market value of 232.5 tons is forced down through the pressure of 32.5 surplus tons on the market. The cost price in 2B is £1.09, but the market value is £1.11. If the market value fell to such an extent that 1A no longer yielded a rent, i.e. if the market value fell to the cost price of 1A to £1.16 then for 2B to use his whole capital, demand would have to grow considerably, since 1A could continue to be exploited, as it yields the normal profit. The market would have to absorb not 32.5, but 92.5 additional tons, 292.5 tons instead of 200, i.e. almost half as much again. This is a very significant increase. If a moderate increase is to take place, the market value would have to fall to such an extent that 1A is driven out of the market. That is, the market price would have to fall below the cost price of 1A, i.e. below £1.10. It would then still be well above the cost price of 2B. We shall therefore add a further 3 tables to the tables A and B, namely C, D, and E. And we shall assume in Table C that the demand grows, that all classes of A and B can continue to produce, but at the market value of B, at which 1A still yields a rent. In Table D, we assume that the demand is sufficient for 1A to continue to yield the normal profit, but no longer a rent. And we shall assume in Table E that the price falls sufficiently to eliminate 1A from the market, but that the fall of the price simultaneously leads to the absorption of the 32.5 surplus tons from 2B. The case assumed in A and B is possible. It is possible that if the rent is reduced from £10 to barely 16 shillings, 1A would withdraw his land from this particular form of exploitation and let it out to another sphere of exploitation, in which it can yield a higher rent. But in this case, 2B would be forced through the process described above to withdraw half his capital if the market did not expand upon the appearance of the new market value. Now let us compile the tables A, B, C, D, and E, but in the manner which should have been adopted from the outset. Capital, total value, total product, market value per ton, individual value per ton, differential value per ton, cost price per ton, absolute rent in tons, differential rent in tons, and total rent, and then the totals of all classes in each table. It is assumed that a capital of 100, being constant and variable capital, is laid out, and that the labor it employs provides surplus labor, that is unpaid labor, amounting to 1/5 of the capital advanced, or a surplus value of 100 over 5. If, therefore, the capital advanced equals £100, the value of the total product must be £120. Supposing furthermore that the average profit is 10%, then 110 pounds is the cost price of the total product, in the above example of coal. With the given rate of surplus value or surplus labor, the 100 pounds capital transforms itself into a value of 120 pounds, whether poor or rich minds are being exploited. In a word, the varying productivity of labor, whether this variation be due to varying natural conditions of labor, or varying social conditions of labor, or varying technological conditions, does not alter the fact that the value of the commodities equals the quantity of labor materialized in them. Thus, to say the value of the product created by the capital of 100 pounds equals 120 simply means that the product contains the labor time materialized in the 100 pounds capital plus 1/6 of labor time, which is unpaid but appropriated by the capitalist. The total value of the product equals 120 pounds, whether the capital of 100 pounds produces 60 tons in one class of mines or 65, 75 or 92.5 in another. But clearly, the value of the individual part, be it measured by the quarter or yard, etc., varies greatly according to the productivity. But to stick to our table, the same applies to every other mass of commodities brought about by capitalist production, the value of 1 ton equals 2 pounds, if the total product of the capital is 60 tons, i.e. 60 tons are worth 120 pounds, or represent labor time equal to that which is materialized in 120 pounds. If the total product amounts to 65 tons, then the value of the individual ton is 11 1/13 of a pound. If it amounts to 75, then the value of the individual is 1 9/15 of a pound. Finally, if it comes to 92.5 tons, then the value per ton is 1 11/37 of a pound. Because the total mass of commodities, or tons, produced by the capital of 100 pounds always has the same value, equal to 120 pounds, since it always represents the same total quantity of labor contained in the 120 pounds, the value of the individual ton varies according to whether the same value is represented in 60, 65, 75, or 92.5 tons. In other words, it varies with the different productivity of labor. It is this difference in the productivity of labor which causes the same quantity of labor to be represented sometimes in a smaller and sometimes in a larger total quantity of commodities, so that the individual part of this total now contains more, now less, of the absolute amount of labor expended, and therefore accordingly has sometimes a larger and sometimes a smaller value. This value of the individual ton, which varies according to whether the capital of 100 pounds is invested in more fertile or less fertile mines, and therefore according to the different productivity of labor, figures in the table as the individual value of the individual ton. Hence, nothing could be further from the truth than the notion that when the value of the individual commodity falls with the rising productivity of labor, the total value of a product produced by a particular capital, for instance 100 pounds, rises because of the increased mass of commodities in which it is now represented. For the value of the individual commodity only falls because the total value, the total quantity of labor expended, is represented by a larger quantity of use values, of products. Hence, a relatively smaller part of the total value, or of the labor expended, falls to the individual product, and this only to the extent to which a smaller quantity of labor is absorbed in it, or a smaller amount of the total value falls to its share. Originally, we regarded the individual commodity as the result and direct product of a particular quantity of labor. Now that the commodity appears as the product of capitalist production, there is a formal change in this respect. The mass of use values which has been produced represents a quantity of labor time, which is equal to the quantity of labor time contained in the capital, that is constant and variable, consumed in its production, plus the unpaid labor time appropriated by the capitalist. If the labor time contained in the capital, as expressed in terms of money, amounts to 100 pounds, and this capital of 100 pounds comprises 40 laid out in wages, and if the surplus labor time amounts to 50% on the variable capital, in other words, the rate of surplus value is 50%, then the value of the total mass of commodities produced by the capital of 100 pounds equals 120 pounds. As we have seen in the first part of this work, if the commodities are to circulate, their exchange value must first be converted into a price, i.e. expressed in terms of money. Thus, before the capitalist throws the commodities onto the market, he must first work out the price of the individual commodity, unless the total product is a single indivisible object, such as, for example, a house, in which the total capital is represented, a single commodity whose price, according to the assumption, would then be 120 pounds, equal to the total value as expressed in terms of money. Price here equals monetary expression of value. According to the varying productivity of labor, the total value of 120 pounds will be distributed over more or fewer products. Thus, the value of the individual product will accordingly be proportionally equal to a larger or smaller part of 120 pounds. The whole operation is quite simple. For example, if the total product equals 60 tons of coal, 60 tons are equal to 120 pounds, and 1 ton therefore equals 120 divided by 60, i.e. 2 pounds. If the product is 65 tons, the value of the individual ton equals 120 over 65, or 1 pound and 16 and 12/13 of a shilling. If the product equals 75 tons, the value of the individual ton is 120 over 75. If it equals 92.5 tons, then it is 120 over 92.5. The value or price of the individual commodity is thus equal to the total value of the product divided by the total number of products, which are measured according to the standard of measurement, such as tons, quarters, yards, etc., appropriate to them as use values. If, therefore, the price of the individual commodity equals the total value of the mass of commodities produced by a capital of 100 pounds divided by the total number of commodities, then the total value equals the price of the individual commodity multiplied by the total number of individual commodities, or it equals the price of a definite quantity of individual commodities multiplied by the total amount of them, measured by this standard of measurement. Furthermore, the total value consists of the value of the capital advanced to production plus the surplus value, that is, of the labor time contained in the capital advanced plus the surplus labor time, or unpaid labor time, appropriated by the capital. Thus, the surplus value contained in each individual part of the commodity is proportional to its value. In the same way as the 120 pounds is distributed among 60, 65, 75, or 92.5 tons, so the 20 pounds surplus value is distributed among them. When the number of tons is 60, and therefore the value of the individual ton equals 120 over 60, which is 2 pounds or 40 shillings, then 1/6 of this 40 shillings, that is 6 2/3 shillings, is the share of the surplus value which falls to the individual ton. The proportion of surplus value in the ton which costs 2 pounds is the same as in the 60 which costs 120. The ratio of surplus value to value remains the same in the price of the individual commodity as in the total of the mass of commodities. In the above example, the total surplus value in each individual ton is 1/3 of 20, which is equal to 1/6 of 40 as above. Hence, the surplus value of the single ton multiplied by 60 is equal to the total surplus value which the capital has produced. If the portion of value which falls to the individual product, the corresponding part of the total value, is smaller because of the larger number of products, i.e. because of the greater productivity of labor, then the portion of surplus value which falls to it, the corresponding part of the total surplus value which adheres to it, is also smaller. But this does not affect the ratio of the surplus value, of the newly created value, to the value advanced and merely reproduced. Although, as we have seen, the productivity of labor does not affect the total value of the product. It may, however, increase the surplus value if the product enters into the consumption of the worker. Then the falling price of the individual commodities, or what is the same thing, of a given quantity of commodities, may reduce the normal wage, or, as again amounts to the same, the value of the labor power. Insofar as the greater productivity of labor creates relative surplus value, it increases not the total value of the product, but that part of this total value which represents surplus value, i.e. unpaid labor. Although, therefore, with the greater productivity of labor, a smaller portion of value falls to the individual product, because the total mass of commodities which represents this value has grown, and thus the price of the individual product falls, that part of this price which represents surplus value, nevertheless, rises under the above-mentioned circumstances, and therefore the proportion of surplus value to reproduced value grows. Actually, here one should still refer to variable capital, for profit has not yet been mentioned. But this is only the case because, as a result of the increased productivity of labor, the surplus value has grown within the total value. The same factor, the increased productivity of labor, which enables a larger mass of products to contain the same quantity of labor, thus lowering the value of a given part of this mass, or the price of the individual commodity, reduces the value of the labor power, therefore increases the surplus or unpaid labor contained in the value of the total product, and hence in the price of the individual commodity. Although thus the price of the individual commodity falls, although the total quantity of labor contained in it, and therefore its value falls, the proportion of surplus value, which is a component part of this value, increases. In other words, the smaller total quantity of labor contained in the individual commodity comprises a greater quantity of unpaid labor than previously, when labor was less productive, when the price of the individual commodity was therefore higher, and the total quantity of labor contained in the individual commodity greater. Although in the present case, 1 ton contains less labor and is therefore cheaper, it contains more surplus labor and therefore yields more surplus value. Since in competition, everything appears in a false form, upside down, the individual capitalist imagines firstly that he has reduced his profit on the individual commodity by reducing its price, but that he makes a greater profit because of the increased mass of commodities. Here, a further confusion is caused by the greater amount of profit which is derived from the increase in capital employed, even with the lower rate of profit. And secondly, that he fixes the price of the individual commodity and by multiplication determines the total value of the product, whereas the original procedure is division, and multiplication is only correct as a derivative method based on that division. The vulgar economist, in fact, does nothing but translate the strange notions of the capitalists who are caught up in competition into seemingly more theoretical language, and seeks to build up a justification of these notions. Now, to return to the table. The total value of the product, or of the quantity of commodities created by a capital of £100 equals £120, however great or small, according to the varying degree of the productivity of labor, the quantity of commodities may be. The cost price of this total product, whatever its size, equals £110, if, as has been assumed, the average profit is 10%. The excess in value of the total product, whatever its size, equals £10, which is 1/12 of the total value, or 1/10 of the capital advanced. This £10, the excess of value over the cost price of the total product, constitutes the rent. It is evidently quite independent from the varying productivity of labor resulting from the different degrees of natural fertility of the mines, types of soil, in short, of the natural element in which the capital of £100 has been employed. For those different degrees in the productivity of the labor employed, arising from the different degrees of fertility of the natural agent, do not prevent the total product from having a value of £120, a cost price of £110, and therefore an excess of value over cost price of £10. All that the competition between capitals can bring about is that the cost price of the commodities which a capitalist can produce with £100 in coal mining, this particular sphere of production, is equal to £110. But competition cannot compel the capitalist to sell the product at £110, which is worth £120, although such compulsion does exist in other industries, because the landlord steps in and lays his hands on the £10. Hence, I call this rent the absolute rent. Accordingly, it always remains the same in the table, however the fertility of the coal mines, and hence the productivity of labor, may change. But, because of the different degrees of fertility of the mines, and thus of the productivity of labor, it is not always expressed in the same number of tons. For according to the varying productivity of labor, the quantity of labor contained in £10 represents more or less use values, more or less tons. Whether, with the variation in degrees of fertility, this absolute rent is always paid in full or only in part, will be seen in the further analysis of the table. There is, furthermore, on the market, coal produced in mines of different productivity. Starting with the lowest degree of productivity, I have called these number 1, 2, 3, and 4. Thus, for instance, the first class produces 60 tons with a capital of £100, the second class produces 65 tons, etc. Capitals of the same size, £100, of the same organic composition within the same sphere of production, do not have the same productivity here, because the degree of productivity of labor varies according to the degree of productivity of the mine or type of soil, in short, of the natural agent. But competition establishes one market value for these products, which have varying individual values. This market value itself can never be greater than the individual value of the product of the least fertile class. If it were higher, then this would only show that the market price stood above the market value. But the market value must represent real value. As regards products of separate classes, it is quite possible that their individual value is above or below the market value. If it is above the market value, the difference between the market value and their cost price is smaller than the difference between their individual value and their cost price. But as the absolute rent equals the difference between their individual value and their cost price, the market value cannot, in this case, yield the entire absolute rent for these products. If the market value sank down to their cost price, it would yield no rent for them at all. They could pay no rent, since rent is only the difference between value and cost price, and for them, individually, this difference would have disappeared because of the fall in the market value. In this case, the difference between the market value and their individual value is negative. That is, the market value differs from their individual value by a negative amount. The difference between market value and individual value, in general, I call differential value. Commodities belonging to the category described here have a minus sign in front of their differential value. If, on the other hand, the individual value of the products of a class of mines or class of land is below the market value, then the market value is above their individual value. The value or market value prevailing in their sphere of production thus yields an excess above their individual value. If, for example, the market value of a ton is £2 and the individual value of a ton is £1 and 12 shillings, then its differential value is 8 shillings. And since in the class in which the individual value of a ton is £1 12 shillings, the capital of £100 produces 75 tons, the total differential value of these 75 tons is 8 shillings times 75, being £30. This excess of the market value for the total product of this class over the individual value of its product, which is due to the relatively greater fertility of the soil or the mine, forms the differential rent, since the cost price for the capital remains the same as before. This differential rent is greater or smaller according to the greater or smaller excess of the market value over the individual value. This excess in turn is greater or smaller according to the relatively greater or smaller fertility of the class of mine or land to which this product belongs, compared with the less fertile class whose product determines market value. Finally, the individual cost price of the products is different in the different classes. For instance, in the class in which a capital of £100 yields 75 tons, the cost price of the individual commodity would be £1 and 9 1/3 shillings, since the total value is £120 and the cost price 110. And if the market value were equal to the individual value in this class, i.e. £1 12 shillings, then the 75 tons sold at £120 would yield a rent of £10, while 110 would represent their cost price. But of course, individual cost price of a single ton varies according to the number of tons in which the capital of £100 is represented, or according to the individual value of the individual products of the various classes. If, for example, the capital of £100 produces 60 tons, then the value per ton is £2, and its cost price £1 and 16 2/3 shillings. 55 tons would be equal to £110, or to the cost price of the total product. If, however, the £100 capital produces 75 tons, then the value per ton is £1 12 shillings. Its cost price, £1 9 1/3 shillings, and 68 3/4 tons of the total product would cost £110, or would replace the cost price. The individual cost price, i.e. the cost price of the individual ton, varies in the different classes in the same proportion as the individual value. It now becomes evident from all these 5 tables that absolute rent always equals the excess of the value of the commodity over its own cost price. The differential rent, on the other hand, is equal to the excess of the market value over its individual value. The total rent, if there is a differential rent apart from the absolute rent, is equal to the excess of the market value over the individual value plus the excess of the individual value over the cost price, or the excess of the market value over the individual cost price. Because here, the purpose is only to set forth the general law of rent as an illustration of my theory of value and cost prices, since I do not intend to give a detailed exposition of rent till dealing with landed property explicitly, I have removed all those factors which complicate the matter, namely the influence of the location of the mines or types of lands, different degree of productivity and different amounts of capital applied to the same mine or to the same type of land, the interrelationship of rents yielded by different lines of production within the same sphere of production, for example by different branches of agriculture, the interrelationship of rents yielded by different branches of production which are, however, interchangeable, such as, for instance, when land is withdrawn from agriculture in order to be used for building houses, etc. All this does not belong here. Section 3. Analysis of the tables. Now for a consideration of the tables. They show how the general law explains a great multiplicity of combinations, while Ricardo, because he had a false conception of the general law of rent, perceived only one side of differential rent, and therefore wanted to reduce the great multiplicity of phenomena to one single case by means of forcible abstraction. The tables are not intended to show all the combinations, but only those which are most important, particularly for our specific purpose. Subsection A. Table A. The relation between market value and individual value in the various classes. In Table A, the market value of a ton of coal is determined by the individual value of a ton in class number 1, where the mine is least fertile. Hence, the productivity of labor is the lowest. Hence, the mass of products yielded by the capital investment of 100 pounds is the smallest, and therefore the price of the individual product, the price as determined by its value, is the highest. It is assumed that the market absorbs 200 tons, neither more nor less. The market value cannot be above the individual value of a ton in number 1, i.e. of that commodity which is produced under the least favorable conditions of production. Number 2 and number 3 sell the ton above their individual values because their conditions of production are more favorable than those of other commodities produced within the same sphere. This does not, therefore, offend against the law of value. On the other hand, the market value could only be above the value of a ton in number 1 if the product of number 1 were sold above its value, quite regardless of market value. A difference between market value and individual value arises in general not because products are sold absolutely above their value, but only because the value of the individual product may be different from the value of the product of a whole sphere. In other words, because the labor time necessary to supply the total product, in this case 200 tons, may differ from the labor time which produces some of the tons, in this case those from 2 and 3, in short, because the total product supplied has been produced by labor of varying degrees of productivity. The difference between the market value and the individual value of a product can therefore only be due to the fact that the definite quantities of labor with which different parts of the total product are manufactured have different degrees of productivity. It can never be due to the value being determined irrespective of the quantity of labor altogether employed in the sphere. The market value could be above 2 pounds per ton only if number 1, on the whole, quite apart from its relation to number 2 and 3, were to sell its product above its value. In this case, the market price would be above the market value because of the state of the market, because of demand and supply. But the market value which concerns us here, and which here is assumed to equal the market price, cannot rise above itself. The market value here equals the value of number 1, which moreover supplies 3/10 of the entire product on the market, since 2 and 3 only supply sufficient amounts to meet the total demand, i.e. to satisfy the additional demand over and above that which is supplied by number 1. 2 and 3 have no cause, therefore, to sell below 2 pounds, since the entire product can be sold at 2 pounds. They cannot sell above 2 pounds because number 1 sells at 2 pounds per ton. This law, that the market value cannot be above the individual value of that product which is produced under the worst conditions of production, but provides a part of the necessary supply, Ricardo distorts into the assertion that the market value cannot fall below the value of that product and must therefore always be determined by it. We shall see later how wrong this is. Because the market value of a ton coincides with the individual value of a ton in number 1, the rent it yields represents the absolute excess of the value over its cost price, the absolute rent, which is 10 pounds. Number 2 yields a differential rent of 10 pounds, and number 3 of 30 pounds, because the market value, which is determined by number 1, yields an excess of 10 pounds for 2 and of 30 pounds for 3 over their individual value, and therefore over the absolute rent of 10 pounds, which represents the excess of the individual value over the cost price. Hence, number 2 yields a total rent of 20 pounds and number 3 of 40, because the market value yields an excess over their cost price of 20 and 40 respectively. We shall assume that the transition is from number 1, the least fertile mine, to the more fertile number 2, and from this to the yet more fertile mine number 3. It is true that number 2 and number 3 are more fertile than number 1, but they satisfy only 7/10 of the total demand, and as we have just explained, can therefore sell their product at 2 pounds, although its value is only 1 pound, 16 and 12/13 shillings, and 1 pound and 12 shillings respectively. It is clear that when the particular quantity required to satisfy demand is supplied, and gradation takes place in the productivity of labor which satisfies the various portions of this demand, whether the transition is in one direction or the other, in both cases, the market value of the more fertile classes will rise above their individual value, in one case because they find that the market value is determined by the unfertile class, and the additional supply provided by them is not great enough to occasion any change in the market value as determined by class number 1, in the other case, because the market value originally determined by them, determined by class 3 or 2, is now determined by class number 1, which provides the additional supply required by the market and can only meet this at a higher value, which now determines the market value. Subsection B. The connection between Ricardo's theory of rent and the conception of falling productivity in agriculture. Changes in the rate of absolute rent and their relation to the changes in the rate of profit. In the case under consideration, for example, Ricardo would say, we start out from class number 3. The additional supply will, in the first place, come from number 2. Finally, the last additional supply, demanded by the market, comes from number 1, since number 1 can provide the additional supply of 60 tons only at 120 pounds, that is, at 2 pounds per ton. And since this supply is needed, the market value of a ton, which was originally £1 12 shillings, and later £1 16 and 12/13 shillings, now rises to 2 pounds. But on the other hand, it is equally true that if we start out from number 1, which satisfied the demand for 60 tons at 2 pounds, then, however, the additional supply is provided by number 2. The product of number 2 is sold at the market value of 2 pounds, although the individual value of it is only £1 16 and 12/13 shillings. For it is still only possible to supply the 125 tons required if number 1 provides 60 tons at a value of 2 pounds per ton. The same applies if a new additional supply of 75 tons is required, but number 3 provides only 75 tons, only supplies the additional demand, and therefore, as before, 60 tons have to be supplied by number 1 at 2 pounds. Had number 1 supplied the whole demand of 200 tons, they would have been sold at 400 pounds. And this is what they are sold at now because number 2 and number 3 do not sell at the price at which they can satisfy the additional demand for 140 tons, but at the price at which number 1, which only supplies 3/10 of the product, could satisfy it. The entire product required, that is 200 tons, is in this case sold at 2 pounds per ton, because 3/10 of it can only be supplied at a value of 2 pounds per ton, irrespective of whether the additional portions of the demand were met by proceeding from number 3 via 2 to 1 or from 1 via 2 to 3. Ricardo says if 3 and 2 are the starting points, their market value must rise to the value, that is cost price with him, of number 1, because the 3/10 supplied by number 1 are required to meet the demand, and the decisive point here is therefore the required volume of the product and not the individual value of particular portions of it. But it is equally true that the 3/10 from number 1 are just as essential as before when number 1 is the starting point and number 2 and number 3 only provide the additional supply. If, therefore, number 1 determined the market value in the descending line, it determines it in the ascending line for the same reasons. Table A thus shows us the incorrectness of the Ricardian concept that differential rent depends on the diminishing productivity of labor, on the movement from the more productive mine or land to the less productive. It is just as compatible with the reverse process, and hence with the growing productivity of labor. Whether the one or the other takes place has nothing to do with the nature and existence of differential rent, but is a historical question. In reality, the ascending and descending lines will cut across one another. The additional demand will sometimes be supplied by going over to more, sometimes to less fertile types of land, mine, or natural agent. In this, it is always supposed that the supply provided by the natural agent of a new different class, be it more fertile or less fertile, only equals the additional demand, and does not therefore bring about a change in the relation between demand and supply. Hence, it can only bring about a change in the market value itself if the supply can only be made available at a higher cost, not, however, if it can be made available at a lower cost. Table A thus reveals to us from the outset the falseness of this fundamental assumption of Ricardo's, which, as Anderson shows, was not required, even on the basis of a wrong conception of absolute rent. If production proceeds in a descending line, from 3 to 2 and from 2 to 1, with recourse to natural agents of a gradually decreasing fertility, then number 3, in which a capital of 100 has been invested, will at first sell its commodities at their value, at 120 pounds. This, since it produces 75 tons, would amount to £1 and 12 shillings per ton. If an additional supply of 65 is then required, number 2, which invests a capital of 100, will similarly sell its product at a value of 120 pounds. This amounts to £1 and 16 and 12/13 shillings per ton. And if finally an additional supply of 60 tons were required, which can only be provided by number 1, then it too will sell its product at a value of 120 pounds, which amounts to £2 per ton. In this process, number 3 would yield a differential rent of 18 and 6/13 pounds as soon as number 2 came on the market, whereas previously it yielded only the absolute rent of 10 pounds. Number 2 would yield a differential rent of 10 pounds as soon as number 1 came into the picture, and differential rent of number 3 would then rise to 30 pounds. Descending from number 3 to number 1, Ricardo discovers that number 1 does not yield a rent because in considering number 3, he started out from the assumption that no absolute rent exists. There is indeed a difference between the ascending and descending line. If the passage is from 1 to 3, so that 2 and 3 only provide the additional supply, then the market value remains equal to the individual value of number 1, which is £2. And if, as the supposition is here, the average profit is 10%, then it can be assumed that the price of coal, or price of wheat, a quarter of wheat, etc., can always be substituted for a ton of coal, will have entered into its calculation, since coal enters into the consumption of the worker as a means of subsistence, as well as figuring as an auxiliary material of considerable importance in constant capital. It can therefore also be assumed that the rate of surplus value would have been higher, and therefore the surplus value itself greater, hence also the rate of profit higher than 10%, if number 1 were more productive, or the value of the ton had been below £2. This, however, would be the case if number 3 was the starting point. The market value of the ton of coal was then only £1 and 12 shillings. When number 2 entered, it rose to £1 and 16 and 12/13 shillings, and finally when number 1 appeared, it rose to £2. It can thus be assumed that when only number 3 was being worked, all other circumstances, the length of surplus labor time and other conditions of production, etc., being taken as constant and unchanged, the rate of profit was higher. The rate of surplus value was higher because one element of the wage was cheaper. Because of the higher rate of surplus value, the mass of surplus value, and therefore also the rate of profit, was higher. In addition, however, with the surplus value thus modified, the rate of profit was higher because an element of cost in the constant capital was lower. The rate of profit became lower with the appearance of number 2, and finally sank to 10%, at the lowest level, when number 1 appeared. In this case, therefore, one would have to assume that, for instance, the rate of profit was 12% when only number 3 was being worked, that it sank to 11% when number 2 came into play, and finally to 10% when number 1 entered into it. In this case, the absolute rent would have been £8 with number 3 because the cost price would have been £112. It would have become £9 as soon as number 2 came into play because now the cost price would have been £111, and it would finally have been raised to £10 because the cost price would have fallen to £110. Here, then, a change in the rate of absolute rent itself would have taken place, and this in inverse ratio to the change in the rate of profit. The rate of rent would have progressively grown because the rate of profit had progressively fallen. The latter would, however, have fallen because of the decreasing productivity of labor in the mines, in agriculture, etc., and the corresponding increase in the price of the means of subsistence and auxiliary materials. Subsection C. Observations on the influence of the change in the value of the means of subsistence and of raw material, hence also the value of machinery, on the organic composition of capital. In this case, the rate of rent rose because the rate of profit fell. Now, did it fall because there was a change in the organic composition of the capital? If the average composition of the capital was 80C and 20V, did this composition remain the same? It is assumed that the normal working day remains the same, otherwise the influence of the increased price of the means of subsistence could be neutralized. We must differentiate between two factors here. Firstly, an increase may occur in the price of the means of subsistence, hence reduction in surplus labor and surplus value. Secondly, constant capital may become more expensive because, as in the case of coal, the auxiliary material, or in the case of wheat, another element of constant capital, namely seeds, rises in value, or also because due to the increased price of wheat, the cost price of other raw produce, that is raw material, may rise. Finally, if the product was iron, copper, etc., the raw material of certain branches of industry and the raw material of machinery, including containers, of all branches of industry, would rise. On the one hand, it is assumed that no change has taken place in the organic composition of capital. In other words, that no change has taken place in the manner of production, decreasing or increasing the amount of living labor employed in proportion to the amount of constant capital employed. The same number of workers as before is required in order to work up the same volume of raw material with the same amount of machinery, etc., or where there is no raw material, to set into motion the same amount of machinery and tools, etc. Besides this first aspect of the organic composition of capital, however, a second aspect has to be considered, namely the change in the value of the elements of capital, although as use values they may be employed in the same portions. Here again we must distinguish the change in value affects both elements, variable and constant, equally. This may never occur in practice. A rise in the price of certain agricultural products, such as wheat, etc., raises the necessary wage and the raw material, for instance, seeds. A rise in coal prices raises the necessary wage and the auxiliary material of most industries. While in the first case, the rise in wages occurs in all branches of industry, that in raw materials occurs only in some. With coal, the proportion in which it enters into wages is lower than that in which it enters into production. As regards total capital, the change in the value of coal and wheat is thus hardly likely to affect both elements of capital equally, but let us suppose this to be the case. Let the value of the product of a capital of 80C and 20V be 120. Considering capital as a whole, the value of the product and its cost price coincide, for the difference is equalized out for the aggregate capital of the country. The rise in value of an article such as coal, which according to the assumption enters into both component parts of capital in equal proportions, brings about a rise in cost by 1/10 for both elements. Thus, 80 pounds constant capital would now only buy as many commodities as could previously be bought with approximately 70 pounds, and with 20 pounds variable capital, only as many workers could be paid as previously with approximately 18 pounds. Or, in order to continue production on the old scale, approximately 90 constant and 22 variable would now have to be laid out. The value of the product as previously is 120 pounds, of which, however, the outlay amounts to 112, being 90C and 22V. Thus, the profit is 8 pounds, and on 112, this works out at 1/14, which is 7 1/7%. Hence, the value of the product from 100 pounds capital advanced is now equal to 107 1/7 pounds. What is the ratio in which C and V now enter into this new capital? Previously, the ratio V to C was as 20 to 80, as 1 to 4. Now it is as 22 to 90, or as 11 to 45. 1 to 4 is as 45 over 180. 11 to 45 is as 44 over 180. That means that variable capital has decreased by 1/180th, as against constant capital. In keeping with the assumption that the increase in the price of coal, etc., has proportionally the same effect on both parts of the capital, we must put it as 88C and 22V. For the value of the product is 120. From this has to be deducted an outlay of 88 and 22, being 110. This leaves a profit of 10 pounds. 22 to 88 is the same as 20 to 80. The ratio of C to V would have remained the same as in the old capital. As before, the ratio would be V to C as 1 to 4. But 10 pounds profit on 110 is 1/11th, which is 9 1/11%. If production is to be continued on the same scale, 110 pounds capital will have to be invested instead of 100, and the value of the product would continue to be 120 pounds. The composition of a capital of 100 pounds, however, would be 80C and 20V, the value of the product being 109 1/11 pounds. If in the above case, the value of 80C had remained constant and only V had varied, i.e. 22V instead of 20V, then the previous ratio having been 20 to 80 or 10 to 40, it would now be 22 to 80 or 11 to 40. Now, if this change had taken place, then the capital would amount to 80 and 22, and the value of the product would be 120. Therefore, the outlay would be 102 and the profit 18, i.e. 17 and 33 over 51%. If 22 pounds variable capital need to be laid out in wages in order to set in motion a constant capital of 80 pounds in value, then 21 and 29 over 51 pounds are required in order to move a constant capital of 78 and 22 over 51 pounds in value. According to this ratio, only 78 and 22 over 51 pounds would be laid out in machinery and raw material from a capital of 100. 21 and 29 over 51 would have to go to wages, whereas previously 80 pounds was spent on raw material, etc., and only 20 pounds on wages. The value of the product is now 117 and 33 over 51, and the composition of the capital, 78 and 22 over 51 constant, and 21 and 29 over 51 variable. Under the previous composition of capital, the total labor put in was equal to 40. Now it is 39 and 11 over 51, or less by 40 over 51. Not because the constant capital is altered in value, but because there is less constant capital to be worked on. Hence, a capital of 100 pounds can set in motion a little less labor than before, although more dearly paid for. If, therefore, a change in an element of cost, here a rise in price or rise in value, only alters the necessary wage, then the following takes place. Firstly, the rate of surplus value falls. Secondly, with the given capital, less constant capital, less raw material and machinery can be employed. The absolute amount of this part of the capital decreases in proportion to the variable capital, and provided other conditions remain the same, this must always bring about a rise in the rate of profit, if the value of the constant capital remains the same. The physical volume of the constant capital decreases, although its value remains the same. But the rate of surplus value decreases, and also the amount of surplus value itself, because the falling rate is not accompanied by an increase in the number of workers employed. The rate of surplus value, or surplus labor, falls more than the ratio of variable to constant capital. For the same number of workers as before, that is, the same absolute quantity of labor, needs to be employed in order to set in motion the same amount of constant capital. Of this absolute quantity of labor, more, however, is necessary labor, and less of it is surplus labor. Thus, the same quantity of labor must be paid for more dearly. Of the same capital, £100 for instance, less can thus be laid out in constant capital, since more has to be laid out in variable capital to set in motion a smaller constant capital. The fall in the rate of surplus value in this case is not connected with an increase in the absolute quantity of labor which a particular capital employs, or with the increase in the number of workers employed by it. The amount of surplus value itself cannot therefore rise here, although the rate of surplus value falls. Provided, therefore, that the organic composition of the capital remains the same, insofar as its physical component parts regarded as use values are concerned, that is, if a change in the composition of capital is not due to a change in the method of production within the sphere in which the capital is invested, but only to a rise in the value of the labor power, and hence to a rise in the necessary wage, which is equal to a decrease in surplus labor, or the rate of surplus value, which in this case can be neither partly nor wholly neutralized by an increase in the number of workers employed by a capital of a given size, for instance £100, then the fall in the rate of profit is simply due to the fall in surplus value itself. If the method of production and the ratio between the amounts of immediate and accumulated labor used remain constant, the same cause then gives rise to the change in the organic composition of capital, a change which is only due to the fact that the value, the proportional value, of the amounts employed has changed. The same capital employs less immediate labor proportionately as it employs less constant capital, but it pays more for this smaller amount of labor. It can therefore only employ less constant capital because the smaller amount of labor which sets in motion this smaller amount of constant capital absorbs a greater part of the total capital. In order, for example, to set in motion 78 pounds of constant capital, it must lay out 22 pounds in variable capital, while previously 20 variable sufficed to set in motion 80 constant. This therefore happens when an increase in the price of a product subjected to landed property only affects wages. The converse would result from the product becoming cheaper. But now let us take the case assumed above. The increased price of the agricultural product is supposed to affect constant and variable capital proportionately to the same degree. According to the assumption, therefore, there is no change in the organic composition of the capital. Firstly, no change in the method of production. The same amount of immediate labor sets in motion the same amount of accumulated labor as before. The ratio of the amounts remains the same. Secondly, no change in the proportion of value as between accumulated and immediate labor. If the value of one rises or falls, so does that of the other in the same proportion to its relative size, which thus remains unchanged. But previously, we had 80 constant and 20 variable, producing a product with a value of 120. Now 88C and 22V producing a product with a value likewise of 120. This yields 10 pounds on 110, or 9 1/11% profit for a capital of 80 constant and 20 variable. Therefore, the value of the product is 109 1/11 pounds. $80 constant represents less raw material, etc. here, and 20 variable less absolute labor in the same proportion. The raw material has become dearer, and a capital of 80 pounds therefore buys a smaller quantity of raw material. Thus, because the method of production has remained the same, it requires less immediate labor. But the smaller quantity of immediate labor costs as much as the larger quantity of immediate labor did before, and it has become dearer exactly to the same extent as the raw material, and has therefore decreased in the same proportion. If, therefore, the surplus value had remained the same, then the rate of profit would have sunk in the same proportion in which the raw material had become dearer, and in which the ratio of the value of the variable to the constant capital had changed. The rate of surplus value, however, has not remained the same, but is changed in the same proportion as the value of the variable capital has grown. Let us take another example. The value of a pound of cotton has gone up from 1 shilling to 2 shillings. Previously, 80 pounds, and we take machinery, etc. here is equal to nil, could buy 1,600 pounds. Now, 80 pounds sterling will only buy 800 pounds. Previously, in order to spin the 1,600 pounds, 20 pounds sterling were required to pay the wages of, say, 20 workers. In order to spin the 800 pounds, only 10 workers are needed, since the method of production has remained the same. The 10 had previously cost 10 pounds sterling. Now they cost 20, just as the 800 pounds of cotton would have previously cost 40 pounds, and now cost 80. Assume now that the profit was previously 20%. This would involve the following. For if the surplus value created by 20 workers is 20, then that created by 10 is 10. In order to produce it, however, 20 pounds need to be paid out as before, whereas according to the earlier relationship, only 10 was paid. The value of the product, of the pound of yarn, must in this case rise at any rate, because it contains more labor, accumulated labor, in the cotton which enters into it, and immediate labor. If only cotton had risen and wages had remained the same, then the 800 pounds of cotton would also have been spun by 10 workers, but these 10 workers would only have cost 10 pounds. That is, the surplus value of 10 would, as before, have amounted to 100%. In order to spin the 800 pounds of cotton, 10 workers would be needed with the capital outlay of 10. Thus, total capital outlay would have been 90 pounds. Now, according to the assumption, there would always be 1 worker per 80 pounds of cotton. Hence, on 800, 10 workers, and on 1,600, 20. How many pounds, therefore, could the total capital of 100 pounds sterling spin now? 88 and 8/9 pounds sterling could be used to buy cotton, and 11 and 1/9 pounds could be laid out in wages. The relative proportions would be as follows. In this case, where no change in the value of variable capital takes place, and the rate of surplus value therefore remains the same, we have the following. In number 1, variable capital is to constant capital as 20 to 80, or 1 to 4. In number 3, it is as 11 and 1/9 to 88 and 8/9, i.e. 1 to 8. It is thus fallen proportionally by 1/2, because the value of constant capital has doubled. The same number of workers spin up the same amount of cotton, but 100 pounds sterling now only employ 11 and 1/9 workers, while the remaining 88 and 8/9 pounds sterling only buy 888 and 8/9 pounds of cotton, instead of 1,600 pounds as in number 1. The rate of surplus value has remained the same, but owing to the change in value of the constant capital, the same number of workers can no longer be employed by a capital of 100 pounds. The ratio between variable and constant capital has changed. Consequently, the amount of surplus value falls, and with it the profit, since this surplus value is calculated on the same amount of capital outlay as before. In the first case, the variable capital, i.e. 20, was 1/4 of the constant capital, in the proportion 20 to 80, and 1/5 of the total capital. Now it is only 1/8 of the constant capital and 1/9 of the total. But 100% on 20 is 20, and 100% on 11 and 1/9 is only 11 and 1/9. If the wage remains the same here, or the value of the variable capital remains the same, its absolute amount falls, because the value of the constant capital has risen. Therefore, the percentage of the variable capital falls, and with it the surplus value itself, its absolute amount, and hence the rate of profit. If the value of the variable capital remains the same, and the method of production remains the same, and therefore the ratio between the amounts of labor, raw material, and machinery employed remains the same, a change in the value of the constant capital brings about the same variation in the composition of capital as if the value of constant capital had remained the same, but a greater amount of capital of unchanged value, thus also a greater capital value, had been employed in proportion to the capital laid out in labor. The consequence is necessarily a fall in profit. The opposite takes place if the value of constant capital falls. Conversely, a change in the value of the variable capital, in this case a rise, increases the proportion of variable to constant capital, and therefore also the percentage of variable capital, or its proportional share in the total. Nevertheless, the rate of profit falls here instead of rising, for the method of production has remained the same. The same amount of living labor as before is employed now in order to convert the same amount of raw materials, machinery, etc. into products. Here, as in the above case, only a smaller total amount of immediate and accumulated labor can be set in motion with the same capital of 100 pounds, but the smaller amount of labor costs more. The necessary wage has risen. A larger share of this smaller amount of labor represents necessary labor, and therefore a smaller amount forms surplus labor. The rate of surplus value has fallen, while at the same time the number of workers, or the total quantity of labor under the command of the same capital, has diminished. The variable capital has increased in proportion to constant capital, and hence also in proportion to the total capital, although the amount of labor employed in proportion to the amount of constant capital has decreased. The surplus value consequently falls, and with it the rate of profit. Previously, the rate of surplus value remained the same, while the rate of profit fell, because the variable capital fell in proportion to the constant capital, and hence in proportion to the total capital. Or the surplus value fell, because the number of workers decreased, its multiplier decreased, while the rate remained the same. This time, the rate of profit falls because the variable capital rises in proportion to the constant capital, hence also to the total. This rise in variable capital is, however, accompanied by a fall in the amount of labor employed, that is, of labor employed by the same capital. In other words, the surplus value falls because its decreasing rate is bound up with the decreasing amount of labor employed. The paid labor has increased in proportion to the constant capital, but the total quantity of labor employed has decreased. These variations in the value, therefore, always affect the surplus value itself, whose absolute amount decreases in both cases because either one or both of its two factors fall. In one case, it decreases because the number of workers decreases while the rate of surplus value remains the same. In the other, because both the rate decreases and the number of workers employed by a capital of £100 decreases. Finally, we come to case number 2, where the change in the value of an agricultural product affects both parts of capital in the same proportion, and where this change of value is therefore not accompanied by a change in the organic composition of capital. In this case, the pound of yarn rises from 1 shilling 6 to 2 shillings 9, since it is the product of more labor time than before. It contains just as much immediate, although more paid and less unpaid, labor as before, but more accumulated labor. Due to the change in the value of cotton from 1 shilling to 2 shillings, 2 shillings instead of 1 is incorporated in the value of the pound of yarn. The table of example number 2, however, is incorrect. We had the labor of 20 workers is represented by £40. Of this, half is unpaid labor here, hence £20 surplus value. According to this ratio, 10 workers will produce a value of £20, and of this, £10 are wages and £10 surplus value. If, therefore, the value of labor power rose in the same proportion as that of the raw material, i.e. if it doubled, then it would be £20 for 10 workers as compared with 20 for 20 workers before. In this case, there would be no surplus labor left, for the value in terms of money which the 10 workers produce is equal to £20, if that which the 20 produce is equal to £40. This is impossible. If this were the case, the basis of capitalist production would have disappeared. Since, however, the changes in value of constant and variable capital are supposed to be the same proportionally, we must put this case differently. Therefore, say the value of cotton rose by 1/3, £80 sterling now buy 1,200 pounds of cotton, whereas previously they bought 1,600. Previously, £1 sterling was 20 pounds of cotton, or 1 pound of cotton was 1 shilling. Now, 1 pound buys 15 pounds of cotton, or 1 pound of cotton is up to 1 shilling 4 pence. Previously, 1 worker cost 1 pound. Now, 1 pound 6 shillings and 8 pence, and for 15 men, that amounts to 20 pounds. Since 20 men produce a value of 40 pounds, 15 men produce a value of 30 pounds. Of this value, 20 are now their wages, and 10 pounds the surplus value, or unpaid labor. Thus, we have the following table. This 1 shilling 10 pence contains cotton worth 1 shilling 4 pence and labor worth 6 pence. The product becomes dearer because the cotton has become dearer by 1/3, but the product is not dearer by 1/3. Previously, in number 1, it was equal to 18 pence. If, therefore, it had become dearer by 1/3, it would now be 24 pence, but it is only equal to 22. Previously, 1,600 pounds of yarn contained 40 pounds sterling worth of labor. Now, 1,200 pounds of yarn contain 30 pounds sterling worth of labor. 1 pound of yarn therefore contains 6 pence of labor. Although the labor has become dearer in the same ratio as the raw material, the quantity of immediate labor contained in the 1 pound of yarn has remained the same, though more of this quantity is now paid and less unpaid labor. This change in the value of wages does not therefore in any way affect the value of the pound of yarn, of the product. Now, as before, labor only accounts for 6 pence, while cotton now accounts for 1 shilling 4 pence instead of 1 shilling as previously. Thus, if the commodity is sold at its value, the change in the value of wages cannot after all bring about a change in the price of the product. Previously, however, 3 pence of the 6 were wages and 3 pence surplus value. Now 4 pence are wages and 2 are surplus value. In fact, 3 pence on wages per pound of yarn comes to 20 pounds sterling for 1,600 pounds of yarn, and 4 pence per pound amounts to 20 pounds sterling for 1,200 pounds of yarn. And 3 pence on the 15 pence, being 1 shilling cotton plus 3 pence wages in the first example, comes to 20% profit. On the other hand, 2 pence on 20, being 16 pence for cotton and 4 pence for wages, comes to 10%. If, in the above example, the price of cotton had remained the same, then we would have the following. One man spends 80 pounds of cotton, since the method of production has remained the same in all examples, and the pound is again equal to 1 shilling. Now the capital is made up as follows in the preceding table. This calculation is wrong, for if a man spends 80 pounds, 20 men spend 1,600, and not 1,466 2/3, since it is assumed that the method of production has remained the same. This fact can in no way be altered by the difference in the remuneration of the man. The example must therefore be constructed as follows. Of this 6 pence, 4 pence for wages and 2 pence for profit, i.e. 12.5%. Finally, if the value of the variable capital remained the same as before, i.e. one man received 1 pound sterling, whereas the value of the constant capital altered, so that 1 pound of cotton is 1 shilling 4 pence, or 16 pence instead of 1 shilling, then we get the following table. The profit would be 3 pence. On 19 pence, this comes to exactly 15 and 15/19%. Now let us put all these examples together, beginning with number 1, where no change of value has as yet taken place. The price of the product has changed in number 3 and number 4, because the value of constant capital has changed. On the other hand, a change in the value of variable capital does not bring about a change in price, because the absolute quantity of immediate labor remains the same and is only differently apportioned between necessary labor and surplus labor. Now what happens in example number 4, where the change in value affects constant and variable capital in equal proportions, where both rise by 1/3? If only wages had risen, as in number 2, then the profit would have fallen from 20% to 12.5, i.e. by 7.5 percentiles. If constant capital alone had risen, as in number 3, profit would have fallen from 20% to 15 and 15/19%, i.e. by 4 and 4/19 percentiles. Since both rise to the same extent, profit falls from 20% to 10%, i.e. by 10 percentiles. But why not by 7.5 plus 4 and 4/19, which is the sum of the differences of 2 and 3? This sum must be accounted for. In accordance with that, the profit should have fallen in table number 4 to 8 and 11/38 instead of to 10. The amount of profit is determined by the amount of surplus value, and this is determined by the number of workers when the rate of surplus labor is given. In number 1, there are 20 workers and half their labor time is unpaid. In number 2, only 1/3 of the total labor is unpaid, thus the rate of surplus value falls. Moreover, 1 1/4 fewer workers are employed, and therefore the number of workers, or the total labor, decreases. In number 3, the rate of surplus value is again the same as in number 1. 1/2 of the working day is unpaid, but as a result of the rise in value of the constant capital, the number of workers falls from 20 to 15 and 15/19, or by 4 and 4/19 workers. In number 4, the rate of surplus value having fallen again to the level of that in number 2, namely 1/3 of the working day, the number of workers decreases by 5, namely from 20 to 15. Compare with number 1, the number of workers in number 4 decreases by 5, compare with number 2 by 3 3/4, and compare with number 3 by 15/19. But compare with number 1, it does not decrease by the sum of number 2 and number 3, i.e. by 5 and 35/76. Otherwise, the number of workers employed in number 4 would be 14 and 41/76. Hence it follows that variations in the value of commodities, which enter into the constant or variable capital, when the method of production or the physical composition of capital remains the same, In other words, when the ratio of immediate and accumulated labor remains constant, do not bring about a change in the organic composition of the capital if they affect the variable and constant capital in the same proportion, as in number 4, where, for instance, cotton becomes dearer to the same degree as the wheat which is consumed by the workers. The rate of profit falls here, while the value of constant and variable capital increases, firstly because the rate of surplus value falls due to the rise in wages, and secondly because the number of workers decreases. The change in value, if it affects only constant capital or only variable capital, acts like a change in the organic composition of capital, and changes the relative value of the component parts of capital, although the method of production remains the same. When only the variable capital is affected, it rises in relation to the constant capital and to the total capital, and not only the rate of surplus value decreases, but also the number of workers employed. Consequently, the amount of constant capital, whose value remains unchanged, is also smaller. See number 2. If the change in value only affects the constant capital, then the variable capital falls in proportion to the constant and to the total capital. Although the rate of surplus value remains the same, its amount decreases because the number of workers employed falls. See number 3. Finally, it would be possible for the change in value to affect both constant and variable capital, but in uneven proportions. This case only requires to be fitted into the above categories. Suppose, for instance, that constant and variable capital were affected in such a way that the value of the former rose by 10% and the latter by 5%. Then insofar as they both rose by 5%, one by 5 plus 5 and the other by 5, we would have case number 4. But insofar as the constant capital changed by a further 5%, we would have case number 3. In the above, we have only assumed a rise in value. With a fall, we have the opposite effect. For example, going from 4 to number 1 can be considered as a fall in value, which affected both component parts in equal proportions. To assess the effect of a fall in only one component part, number 2 and number 3 would have to be modified. I would make the following further observation on the influence of the variation of value upon the organic composition of capital. With capitals in different branches of production, with an otherwise equal physical composition, it is possible that the higher value of the machinery or of the material used may bring about a difference. For instance, if the cotton, silk, linen, and wool industries had exactly the same physical composition, the mere difference in the cost of the material used would create such a variation. Subsection D. Changes in the total rent dependent on changes in the market value. Returning to Table A, it thus follows that the assumption that the profit of 10% has come about through a decrease may be correct, namely if the development actually proceeded along the descending line. But this assumption by no means necessarily follows from the gradation of rents, the mere existence of differential rents. On the contrary, with the ascending line, this gradation of rents presupposes that the rate of profit remains the same over a long period. Table B. As has already been explained above, in this example, the competition from number 3 and number 4 forces the cultivator of number 2 to withdraw half of his capital. With a descending line, it would on the contrary appear that an additional supply of only 32.5 tons is required. Hence, only a capital of £50 has to be invested in number 2. But the most interesting aspect of the table is this. Previously, a capital of £300 was invested, now only 250, i.e. 1/6 less. The amount of product has, however, remained the same, 200 tons. The productivity of labor has thus risen, and the value of the individual commodity has fallen. The total value of the commodities has likewise fallen, from £400 to 369 3/13. As compared with A, the market value per ton has fallen from £2 to £1 and 16 12/13 shillings, since the new market value is determined by the individual value of number 2, instead of as previously by the higher one of number 1. Despite all these circumstances, decrease in the capital invested, decrease in the total value of the product with the same volume of production, fall in the market value, exploitation of more fertile classes, the rent in B, as compared with A, has risen absolutely by 24 3/13 that is, 94 3/13 as against 70. If we examine how far the individual classes participate in the increase in total rent, we find that in class number 2, the absolute rent, insofar as its rate is concerned, has remained the same, for £5 on £50 equals 10%, but its amount has fallen by half, from £10 to £5, because the capital investment in 2B has fallen by half, from £100 to £50. Class 2B, instead of effecting an increase in the rental, effects a decrease by £5. Furthermore, the differential rent for 2B has completely disappeared, because the market value is now equal to the individual value of number 2. This results in a second loss of £10. Altogether then, the reduction in rent for Class 2 amounts to £15. In number 3, the amount of absolute rent is the same, but as a result of the fall in market value, its differential value has also fallen, hence also the differential rent. It amounted to £30, now it amounts only to 18 6/13. This is a reduction by 11 7/13. The rent for number 2 and number 3 taken together has therefore fallen by 26 7/13 It remains to account for a rise not of 24 3/13, as at first sight it would seem, but of 50 10/13. Furthermore, however, for B as compared with A, the absolute rent of 1A has disappeared, as class number 1 itself has disappeared. This represents a further reduction by £10. Thus, all in all, 60 10/13 must be accounted for. But this is the rental of the new class 4B. The rise in the rental of B is therefore only to be explained by the rent from 4B. The absolute rent for 4B, like that of all other classes, is £10. The differential rent of 50 10/13, however, is due to the fact that the differential value of number 4 is 10 and 470 over 481 shillings per ton, and this has to be multiplied by 92.5, for that is the number of tons. The fertility of number 2 and number 3 has remained the same. The least fertile class has been removed entirely, and yet the rental rises because, due to its relatively great fertility, the differential rent of number 4 alone is greater than the total differential rent of A had been previously. Differential rent does not depend on the absolute fertility of the classes that are cultivated. For 1, 2, 3, and 4B are more fertile than 1, 2, and 3A, and yet the differential rent for 1, 2, 3, and 4B is greater than it was for 1, 2, and 3A because the greatest portion of the product, 92.5 tons, is supplied by a class whose differential value is greater than that occurring in 1, 2, and 3A. When the differential value for a class is given, the absolute amount of its differential rent naturally depends on the amount of its product. But this amount itself is already taken into account in the calculation and formation of the differential value. Because with £100, number 4 produced 92.5 tons, no more and no less, its differential value in B, where the market value is £1 and 16 12/13 shillings per ton, amounts to 10 and 470 over 481 shillings per ton. The whole rental in A amounts to £70 on £300 capital, which is 23 1/3%. On the other hand, in B, leaving out of account the 3/13, it is £94 on 250, which is 37 3/5%. Table C. Here it is assumed that class number 4 having come into the picture and class number 2 determining the market value, demand does not remain the same as in Table B, but it increases with the falling price, so that the whole of the 92.5 tons which have been newly added by number 4 is absorbed by the market. At £2 per ton, only 200 tons would be absorbed. At 1 11/13 pounds, the demand grows to 292.5. It is wrong to assume that the limits of the market are necessarily the same at 1 11/13 pounds per ton as at £2 per ton. On the contrary, the market expands to a certain extent with the falling price, even in the case of a general means of subsistence, such as wheat. This, for the time being, is the only point to which we want to draw attention in Table C. Table D. Here it is assumed that the 292.5 tons are absorbed by the market only if the market value falls to 1 5/6 pounds, which is the cost price per ton for class number 1, which therefore bears no rent but only yields the normal profit of 10%. This is the case which Ricardo assumes to be the normal case, and on which we should therefore dwell at somewhat greater length. As in the preceding tables, the ascending line is here presupposed at the outset. Later we shall look at the same process in the descending line. If 2, 3, and 4 only provided an additional supply of 140, that is, an additional supply which the market absorbs at £2 per ton, then number 1 would continue to determine the market value. But this is not the case. There is a surplus of 92.5 tons on the market, produced by class number 4. If this were in fact surplus production, which exceeded the absolute requirements of the market, then number 1 would be completely thrown out of the market, and number 2 would have to withdraw half its capital as in B. Number 2 would then determine the market value as in B. But it is assumed that if the market value decreases, the market can absorb the 92.5 tons. How does this occur? Numbers 4, 3, and 2 dominate the market absolutely. In other words, if the market could only absorb 200 tons, they would throw out number 1. But to begin with, let us take the actual position. There are now 292.5 tons on the market, whereas previously there were only 200. Number 2 would sell at its individual value, at 1 11/13 pounds, in order to make room for itself and to drive number 1, whose individual value is 2 pounds, out of the market. But since, even at this market value, there is no room for the 292.5 tons, number 4 and number 3 exert pressure on number 2, until the market price falls to 1 5/6 pounds, at which price the classes 4, 3, and 2, and number 1, find room for their product on the market, which at this market price absorbs the whole product. Through this fall in price, supply and demand are balanced. As soon as the additional supply surpasses the capacity of the market, as determined by the old market value, each class naturally seeks to force the whole of its product onto the market to the exclusion of the product of the other classes. This can only be brought about through a fall in price, and moreover, a fall to the level where the market can absorb all products. If this reduction in price is so great that the classes 1, 2, etc. have to sell below their costs of production, they naturally have to withdraw their capital from production. If, however, the situation is such that the reduction does not have to be so great in order to bring the output into line with the state of the market, then the total capital can continue to work in this sphere of production at this new market value. But it is further clear that in these circumstances, it is not the worst land, number 1 and number 2, but the best, number 3 and number 4, which determines the market value, and so also the rent on the best sorts of land determines those on the worst, as Stork correctly grasped in relation to this case. Number 4 sells at the price at which it can force its entire product onto the market, overcoming all resistance from the other classes. This price is 1 5/6 pounds. If the price were higher, the market would contract, and the process of mutual exclusion would begin again. That number 1 determines the market value is correct only on the assumption that the additional supply from number 2, etc., is only the additional supply which the market can absorb at the market value of number 1. If it is greater, then number 1 is quite passive, and by the room it takes up, only compels number 2, 3, and 4 to react until the price has contracted sufficiently for the market to be large enough for the whole product. Now it happens that at this market value, which is in fact determined by number 4 itself pays a differential rent of 49 7/12 pounds in addition to the absolute rent. Number 3 pays a differential rent of 17.5 pounds, and number 2, on the other hand, pays no differential rent, and moreover, only pays a part of the absolute rent, 9 1/6 pounds instead of 10, i.e. not the full amount of the absolute rent. Why? Although the new market value of 1 5/6 pounds is above its cost price, it is below its individual value. If the market value were equal to its individual value, it would pay the absolute rent of 10 pounds, which is equal to the difference between individual value and cost price. But since it is below that, it only pays a part of its absolute rent, 9 1/6 pounds instead of 10. The actual rent it pays is equal to the difference between market value and cost price, but this difference is smaller than that between its individual value and its cost price. The actual rent is equal to the difference between market value and cost price. The absolute rent is equal to the difference between individual value and cost price. The differential rent is equal to the difference between market value and individual value. The actual or total rent is equal to the absolute rent plus the differential rent. In other words, it is equal to the excess of the market value over the individual value plus the excess of the individual value over the cost price. Or it is equal to the difference between market value and cost price. If, therefore, the market value is equal to the individual value, the differential rent is nil, and the total rent is equal to the difference between individual value and cost price. If the market value is greater than the individual value, the differential rent is equal to the excess of the market value over the individual value. The total rent, however, is equal to this differential rent plus the absolute rent. If the market value is smaller than the individual value, but greater than the cost price, the differential rent is a negative quantity. Hence, the total rent is equal to the absolute rent plus this negative differential rent, i.e. the excess of individual value over the market value. If the market value is equal to the cost price, then on the whole rent is nil. In order to put this down in the form of equations, we shall call absolute rent AR, the differential rent DR, the total rent TR, the market value MV, the individual value IV, and the cost price CP. We then have the following equations. In the circumstances assumed, number 1 pays no rent. Why not? Because the absolute rent is equal to the difference between the individual value and the cost price. The differential rent, however, is equal to the difference between the market value and the individual value. But the market value here is equal to the cost price of number 1. The individual value of number 1 is £2 per ton. The market value, 1 5/6 pounds. The differential rent of number 1, therefore, is minus 1/6 of a pound. The absolute rent of number 1, however, is equal to the difference between its individual value and its cost price, which is 1/6 of a pound. Since, therefore, the actual rent of number 1 is equal to the absolute rent, being 1/6 of a pound, and the differential rent, being minus 1/6 of a pound, it is equal to 0. Thus, Category 1 pays neither differential rent nor absolute rent, but only the cost price. The value of its product is £2. It is sold at 1 5/6 pounds. That means 1/12 below its value, which is 8 1/3% below its value. Category 1 cannot sell at a higher price because the market is determined not by number 1, but by 4, 3, and 2 in opposition to 1. Category 1 can merely provide an additional supply at the price of 1 5/6 pounds. That number 1 pays no rent is due to the fact that the market value is equal to its cost price. This fact, however, is the result. Firstly, of the relatively low productivity of number 1. What it has to supply is 60 additional tons at 1 5/6 pounds. Suppose instead of supplying only 60 tons for 100, number 1 supplied 64 tons for 100, i.e. 1 ton less than class number 2. Then only 93 3/4 pounds capital would have to be invested in number 1 in order to supply 60 tons. The individual value of 1 ton in number 1 would then be 1 7/8 pounds, or £1 and 17.5 shillings. Its cost price would be £1 and 14 3/8 shillings. And since the market value is 1 5/6 pounds, being £1 and 16 2/3 shillings, the difference between cost price and market value is 2 and 7/24 shillings. And on 60 tons, this would amount to a rent of £6 and 17.5 shillings. If, therefore, all the circumstances remain the same and number 1 were more productive than it is by 1/15, since 60 over 15 equals 4, it would still pay a part of the absolute rent because there would be a difference between the market value and its cost price, although a smaller difference than between its individual value and its cost price. Here, the worst land would therefore still bear a rent if it were more fertile than it is. If number 1 were absolutely more fertile than it is, number 2, 3, and 4 would be relatively less fertile compared with it. The difference between its value and their individual values would be smaller. The fact that number 1 bears no rent is therefore just as much due to the circumstance that it is not absolutely more fertile as to the fact that 2, 3, and 4 are not relatively less fertile. Secondly, however, given the productivity of number 1 as 60 tons for 100, if 2, 3, and 4, and especially 4, which enters the market as a new competitor, were less fertile, not only relatively as against number 1, but absolutely, then Category 1 could yield a rent even though this would only consist of a fraction of the absolute rent. For instance, the market absorbs 292.5 tons at 1 5/6 pounds. It would also absorb a smaller number of tons, for instance 280 tons, at a market value higher than 1 5/6 pounds. Every market value, however, which is higher than 1 5/6 pounds, i.e. higher than the production costs of number 1, yields a rent for number 1, equal to the market value minus the cost price of number 1. It can thus be equally well said that number 1 yields no rent because of the absolute productivity of number 4. For as long as 2 and 3 were the only competitors on the market, it yielded a rent and would continue to do so even despite the advent of number 4, despite the additional supply, although it would be a lower rent, if, for a capital outlay of £100, number 4 produced 80 tons instead of 92.5. Thirdly, we have assumed that the absolute rent for a capital outlay of £100 is £10, that is 10% on the capital, or 1/11th on the cost price, and that therefore the value of the product yielded by a capital of £100 in agriculture is £120, of which £10 are profit. It would be wrong to assume that if we say £100 capital is laid out in agriculture, and if 1 working day equals £1, then 100 working days are laid out. In general, if a capital of £100 equals 100 working days, then in whatever branch of production this capital may be laid out, the newly created value is never equal to 100 working days. Supposing that 1 gold sovereign equals 1 working day of 12 hours, and that this is the normal working day, then the first question is, what is the rate of exploitation of labor? That is, how many of these 12 hours does the worker work for himself, for the reproduction of the equivalent of his wage, and how many does he work for the capitalist gratis? How great, therefore, is the labor time which the capitalist sells without having paid for it, and which is therefore the source of the surplus value, and serves to augment the capital? If the rate of exploitation is 50%, then the worker works 8 hours for himself and 4 gratis for the capitalist. The product equals 12 hours, which is £1, since, according to this assumption, 12 hours labor time are contained in 1 gold sovereign. Of these 12 hours, equal to £1, 8 recoup the capitalist for the wage, and 4 form his surplus value. Thus, on a wage of 13 1/3 shillings, surplus value equals 6 2/3 shillings, or on a capital outlay of £1, it is 10 shillings, and on £100, £50. Then the value of the commodity produced with the £100 capital would be 150. The profit of the capitalist, in fact, consists in the sale of the unpaid labor contained in the product. The normal profit is derived from this sale of that which has not been paid for. But the second question is this: what is the organic composition of the capital? That part of the value of the capital which consists of machinery, etc., and raw material is simply reproduced in the product. It reappears, remaining unaltered. This part of the capital, the capitalist must pay for at its value. It thus enters into the product as a given predetermined value. Only the labor used by the capitalist is merely partly paid for by him, although it enters wholly into the value of the product, and is wholly bought by him. Assuming the above to be the rate of exploitation of labor, the amount of surplus value for capital of the same size will therefore depend on its organic composition. If the capital A consists of £80 constant and £20 variable, then the value of the product is £110, and the profit is 10, although it contains 50% unpaid labor. If the capital B consists of 40 constant and 60 variable, then the value of the product is 130 and the profit is 30, although it too contains only 50% unpaid labor. If the capital C consists of 60 constant and 40 variable, then the value of the product is 120 and the profit is 20, although in this case too, it comprises 50% unpaid labor. Thus, the 3 capitals, equal to £300, yield a total profit of £60, and this makes an average of 20% for 100. This average profit is made by each of the capitals if it sells the commodity it produces at £120. The capital A sells it at £10 above its value, capital B sells it at £10 below its value, and capital C sells it at its value. All the commodities taken together are sold at their value, being £360. In fact, the value of A plus B plus C equals 360, but the prices of the individual categories are partly above, partly below, and partly at their value, so that each yields a profit of 20%. The values of the commodities thus modified are their cost prices, which competition constantly sets as centers of gravitation for market prices. Now assume that the £100 laid out in agriculture is composed of 60 constant and 40 variable, which incidentally is perhaps still too low for the variable capital. Then the value of the product is £120. But this would be equal to the cost price in the industry. Suppose, therefore, in the above case, that the average price of the product produced by a capital of 100 is 110. We now say that if the agricultural product is sold at its value is £10 above its cost price. It then yields a rent of 10%, and this we assume to be the normal thing in capitalist production, that in contrast to other products, the agricultural product is not sold at its cost price, but at its value as a result of landed property. The organic composition of the aggregate capital is 80 constant and 20 variable, if the average profit is 10%. We assume that of the agricultural capital is 60 constant and 40 variable. That is, in its composition, wages, immediate labor, have a larger share than in the total capital invested in the other branches of industry. This indicates a relatively lower productivity of labor in this branch. It is true that in some types of agriculture, for instance in stock raising, the composition may be 90 constant and 10 variable, i.e. the ratio of V to C may be smaller than in the total industrial capital. Rent is, however, not determined by this branch, but by agriculture proper, and furthermore, by that part of it which produces the principal means of subsistence, such as wheat, etc. The rent in the other branches is not determined by the composition of the capital invested in these branches themselves, but by the composition of the capital, which is used in the production of the principal means of subsistence. The mere existence of capitalist production presupposes that vegetable food, not animal food, is the largest element in the means of subsistence. The interrelationship of the rents in the various branches is a secondary question that does not interest us here and is therefore left out of consideration. In order, therefore, to make the absolute rent equal to 10%, it is assumed that the general average composition of the non-agricultural capital is 80 constant and 20 variable, and that of agricultural capital is 60 constant and 40 variable. The question now is whether it would make any difference to case D, where class number 1 pays no rent, if the agricultural capital were differently constituted, for example 50 constant and 50 variable, or 70 and 30. In the first case, the value of the product would be 125, in the second 115. In the first case, the difference arising from the different composition of the non-agricultural capital would be 15 pounds. In the second, it would be 5. That is, the difference between the value of the agricultural product and the cost price would in the first case be 50% higher than has been assumed above, and in the second 50% lower. If the former were the case, if the value of the product of 100 pounds were 125, then the value per ton of number 1 would be equal to 212 pounds in table A. And this would be the market value for A, for class number 1 determines the market value here. The cost price for 1A, on the other hand, would be 1.56 pounds, as before, since, according to the assumption, the 292.5 tons are only saleable at 1.56 pounds. This would therefore make no difference, just as it would make no difference if the agricultural capital were composed of 70 constant and 30 variable, or the difference between the value of the agricultural produce and its cost price were only 5 pounds, i.e. half the amount previously assumed. If the cost price, and therefore the average organic composition of the non-agricultural capital, were assumed to be constant at 80 constant and 20 variable, then it would make no difference to this case, that is 1D, whether the organic composition of the agricultural capital were higher or lower, although it would make a considerable difference to table A, and it would make a difference of 50% in the absolute rent. But let us now assume the opposite, that the composition of the agricultural capital remains 60 constant and 40 variable, as before, and that of the non-agricultural capital varies. Instead of being 80 constant and 20 variable, let it be either 70 and 30 or 90 and 10. In the first case, the average profit would be 15 pounds, or 50% higher than in the supposed case. In the other, it would be 5 pounds, or 50% lower. In the first case, the absolute rent would be 5 pounds. This would again make no difference to 1D. In the second case, the absolute rent would be 15 pounds. This too would make no difference to case 1D. All this would therefore be of no consequence to 1D, however important it may continue to be for tables A, B, C, and E, i.e. for the absolute determination of the absolute and differential rent, whenever the new class, be it in the ascending or the descending line, only supplies the necessary additional demand at the old market value. Now the following question arises. Can this case D occur in practice? And even before this, we must ask, is it, as Ricardo assumes, the normal case? It can only be the normal case either if the agricultural capital is equal to 80 constant and 20 variable, that is, to the average composition of the non-agricultural capital, so that the value of the agricultural produce would be equal to the cost price of the non-agricultural produce. For the time being, this is statistically wrong. The assumption of this relatively lower productivity of agriculture is at any rate more appropriate than Ricardo's assumption of a progressive absolute decrease in productivity. In Chapter 1 on value, Ricardo assumes that the average composition of capital prevails in gold and silver mines, although he only speaks of fixed and circulating capital here, but we shall correct this. According to this assumption, these mines could only yield a differential rent, never an absolute rent. The assumption itself, however, in turn rests on the other assumption that the additional supply provided by the richer mines is always greater than the additional supply required at the old market value. But it is absolutely incomprehensible why the opposite cannot equally well take place. The mere existence of differential rent already proves that an additional supply is possible without altering the given market value. For number 4 or number 3 or number 2 would yield no differential rents if they did not sell at the market value of number 1, however this may have been determined. That is, if they did not sell at a market value which is determined independently of the absolute amount of their supply. Or, case D would always have to be the normal one if the conditions presupposed in it are always the normal ones. In other words, if number 1 is always forced by the competition from number 4, 3, and 2, especially from 4, to sell its product below its value by the whole amount of the absolute rent, that is, at the cost price. The mere existence of differential rent in 4, 3, and 2 proves that they sell at a market value which is above their individual value. If Ricardo assumes that this cannot be the case with number 1, then it is only because he presupposes the impossibility of absolute rent, and the latter because he presupposes the identity of value and cost price. Let us take case C, where the 292.5 tons find a sale at a market value of £1 and 16 12/13 shillings. And like Ricardo, let us start out from number 4. So long as only 92.5 tons are required, number 4 will sell at £1 and 5 35/37 shillings per ton, i.e. it will sell commodities that have been produced with the capital of £100 at their value of 120, which yields the absolute rent of £10. Why should number 4 sell its commodity below its value at its cost price? So long as it alone is there, number 3, 2, and 1 cannot compete with it. The mere cost price of number 3 is above the value which yields number 4 a rent of £10, and even more so the cost price of number 2 and number 1. Therefore, number 3, etc. could not compete even if they sold these tons at the bare cost price. Let us assume that there is only one class, the best or the worst type of land, number 4 or number 1, or number 3 or number 2. This makes no difference whatsoever to the theory. Let us assume that its supply is unlimited, that is, relatively unlimited compared to the amount of the given capital and labor which is in general available, and can be absorbed in this branch of production, so that land forms no barriers and provides a relatively unlimited field of action for the available amount of labor and capital. Let us assume, therefore, that there is no differential rent because there is no cultivation of land of varying natural fertility, hence there is no differential rent, or else only to a negligible extent. Furthermore, let us assume that there is no landed property. Then clearly there is no absolute rent, and therefore, as according to our assumption there is no differential rent, there is no rent at all. This is a tautology, for the existence of absolute rent not only presupposes landed property, but it is the posited landed property, i.e. landed property contingent on and modified by the action of capitalist production. This tautology in no way helps us to settle the question, since we explain that absolute rent is formed as the result of the resistance offered by landed property in agriculture to the capitalist leveling out of the values of commodities to average prices. If we remove this action on the part of landed property, this resistance, the specific resistance which the competition between capitals comes up against in this field of action, we naturally abolish the precondition on which the existence of rent is based. Incidentally, as Mr. Wakefield sees very well in his colonial theory, there is a contradiction in the assumption itself. On the one hand, developed capitalist production. On the other hand, the non-existence of landed property. Where are the wage laborers to come from in this case? A somewhat analogous development takes place in the colonies, even where, legally, landed property exists, insofar as the government gives land gratis, as happened originally in the colonization from England, and even where the government actually institutes landed property by selling the land, though at a negligible price, as in the United States, at $1 or something of the sort per acre. Two different aspects must be distinguished here. Firstly, there are the colonies proper, such as in the United States, Australia, etc. Here, the mass of the farming colonists, although they bring with them a larger or smaller amount of capital from the motherland, are not capitalists, nor do they carry on capitalist production. They are more or less peasants who work themselves, and whose main object in the first place is to produce their own livelihood, their means of subsistence. Their main product, therefore, does not become a commodity, and is not intended for trade. They sell or exchange the excess of their products over their own consumption for imported manufactured commodities, etc. The other, smaller section of the colonists who settle near the sea, navigable rivers, etc., form trading towns. There is no question of capitalist production here either. Even if capitalist production gradually comes into being, so that the sale of his products and the profit he makes from this sale become decisive for the farmer who himself works and owns his land, so long as, compared with capital and labor, land still exists in elemental abundance, providing a practically unlimited field of action, the first type of colonization will continue as well, and production will therefore never be regulated according to the needs of the market at a given market value. Everything the colonists of the first type produce over and above their immediate consumption, they will throw on the market and sell at any price that will bring in more than their wages. They are, and continue for a long time to be, competitors of the farmers who are already producing more or less capitalistically, and thus keep the market price of the agricultural product constantly below its value. The farmer who therefore cultivates land of the worst kind will be quite satisfied if he makes the average profit on the sale of his farm, i.e. if he gets back the capital invested. This is not the case in very many instances. Here, therefore, we have two essentially different conditions competing with one another. Capitalist production is not as yet dominant in agriculture. Secondly, although landed property exists legally, in practice it only exists as yet sporadically, and strictly speaking, there is only possession of land. Or although landed property exists in a legal sense, it is, in view of the elemental abundance of land relative to labor and capital, as yet unable to offer resistance to capital, to transform agriculture into a field of action, which in contrast to non-agricultural industry, offers specific resistance to the investment of capital. In the second type of colonies, plantations, where commercial speculations figure from the start and production is intended for the world market, the capitalist mode of production exists, although only in a formal sense, since slavery precludes free wage labor, which is the basis of capitalist production. But the business in which slaves are used is conducted by capitalists. The method of production which they introduce has not arisen out of slavery, but is grafted onto it. In this case, the same person is a capitalist and landowner, and the elemental existence of the land confronting capital and labor does not offer any resistance to capital investment, hence none to the competition between capitals. Neither does a class of farmers as distinct from landlords develop here. So long as these conditions endure, nothing will stand in the way of cost price regulating market value. All these preconditions have nothing to do with the preconditions in which an absolute rent exists. That is, on the one hand, developed capitalist production, and on the other, landed property, not only existing in the legal sense, but actually offering resistance and defending the field of action against capital, only making way for it under certain conditions. In these circumstances, an absolute rent will exist, even if only number 4, or number 3, or number 2, or number 1 are cultivated. Capital can only win new ground in that solely existing class of land by paying rent, that is, by selling the agricultural product at its value. It is, moreover, only in these circumstances that there can first be talk of a comparison and a difference between the capital invested in agriculture, i.e. in a natural element as such in primary production, and that invested in non-agricultural industry. But the next question is this. If one starts out from number 1, then clearly numbers 2, 3, and 4, if they only provide the additional supply admissible at the old market value, will sell at the market value determined by number 1. And therefore, apart from the absolute rent, they will yield a differential rent in proportion to their relative fertility. On the other hand, if number 4 is the starting point, then it appears that certain objections could be made. For we saw that number 2 in tables B and C draws the absolute rent if the product is sold at its value of £1 and 16 and 12/13 shillings. In table D, the cost price of number 3, the next class in the descending line, is higher than the value of number 4, which yields a rent of £10. Thus, there cannot be any question of competition or underselling here, even if number 3 sold at its cost price. If number 4, however, no longer satisfies the demand, if more than 92.5 tons are required, then its price will rise. In the above case, it would have to rise by 3 and 43/111 shillings per ton, before number 3 could enter the field as a competitor, even at its cost price. The question is, will it enter into it in these circumstances? Let us put this case another way. For the price of number 4 to rise to £1 and 12 shillings, that is the individual value of number 3, the demand would not have to rise by 75 tons. This applies especially to the dominant agricultural product, where an insufficiency in supply will bring about a much greater rise in price than corresponds to the arithmetical deficiency in supply. But if number 4 had risen to £1 and 12 shillings, then at this market value, which is equal to number 3's individual value, the latter would pay the absolute rent and number 4 a differential rent. If there is any additional demand at all, number 3 can sell at its individual value, since it would then dominate the market value and there would be no reason at all for the landowner to forego the rent. But say the market price of number 4 only rose to £1 and 9 1/3 shillings, the cost price of number 3. Or in order to make the example even more striking, suppose the cost price of number 3 is only £1 5 shillings, i.e. only 1 and 8/37 shillings higher than the cost price of number 4. It must be higher because its fertility is lower than that of number 4. Can number 3 be taken in hand now and thus compete with number 4, which sells above number 3's cost price, namely at £1 and 5 and 35/37 shillings? Either there is an additional demand or not. In the first case, the market price of number 4 has risen above its value, and then, whatever the circumstances, number 3 would sell above its cost price, even if not to the full amount of its absolute rent. Or there is no additional demand. Here, in turn, we have two possibilities. Competition from number 3 could only enter into it if the farmer of number 3 were at the same time its owner. If to him, as a capitalist, landed property would not be an obstacle, would offer no resistance because he has control of it, not as capitalist, but as landowner. His competition would force number 4 to sell below its hitherto prevailing price of £1 and 5 and 35/37 shillings, and even below the price of £1 and 5 shillings. And in this way, number 3 would be driven out of the field. And number 4 would be capable of driving number 3 out every time. It would only have to reduce the price to the level of its own costs of production, which are lower than those of number 3. But if the market expanded as a result of the reduction in price engendered by number 3, what then? Either the market expands to such an extent that number 4 can dispose of its 92.5 tons as before, despite the newly added 75, or it does not expand to this degree, so that a part of the product of number 4 and number 3 would be surplus. In this case, number 4, since it dominates the market, would continue to lower the price until the capital in number 3 is reduced to the appropriate size. That is, until only that amount of capital is invested in it as is just sufficient for the entire product of number 4 to be absorbed. But at £1 and 5 shillings, the whole product would be saleable, and since number 3 sold a part of the product at this price, number 4 could not sell above that. This, however, would be the only possible case. Temporary overproduction not engendered by an additional demand, but leading to an expansion of the market. And this can only be the case if capitalist and landowner are identical in number 3, i.e. if it is assumed once again that landed property does not exist as a power confronting capital, because the capitalist himself is landowner and sacrifices the landowner to the capitalist. But if landed property as such confronts capital in number 3, then there is no reason at all why the landowner should hand over his acres for cultivation without drawing a rent from them. Why he should hand over his land before the price of number 4 has risen to a level which is at least above the cost price of number 3. If this rise is only small, then in any country under capitalist production, number 3 will continue to be withheld from capital as a field of action, unless there is no other form in which it can yield a rent. But it will never be put under cultivation before it yields a rent, before the price of number 4 is above the cost price of number 3. i.e. before number 4 yields a differential rent in addition to its old rent. With the further growth of demand, the price of number 3 would rise to its value, since the cost price of number 2 is above the individual value of number 3. Number 2 would be cultivated as soon as the price of number 3 had risen above £1 and 13 and 11/13 shillings, and so yielded some rent for number 2. But it has been assumed in D that number 1 yields no rent, but this only because number 1 has been assumed to be already cultivated land, which is being forced to sell below its value, at its cost price, because of the change in market value brought about by the entry of number 4. It will only continue to be thus exploited if the owner is himself the farmer, and therefore in this individual case, landed property does not confront capital, or if the farmer is a small capitalist prepared to accept less than 10%, or a worker who only wants to make his wage, or a little more, and hands over his surplus labor, which is equal to £10 or £9 or less, to the landowner instead of to the capitalist. Although in the two latter cases, a farm rent is paid, yet economically speaking, no rent, and we are concerned here with the latter sense. In the one case, the farmer is a mere laborer, in the other, something between laborer and capitalist. Nothing could be more absurd than the assertion that the landowner cannot withdraw his acres from the market just as easily as the capitalist can withdraw his capital from a branch of production. The best proof of this is the large amount of fertile land that is uncultivated in the most developed countries of Europe, such as England, the land which is taken out of agriculture and put to the building of railways or houses, or is reserved for this purpose, or is transformed by the landlord into rifle ranges or hunting grounds, as in the Highlands of Scotland, etc. The best proof of this is the vain struggle of the English workers to lay their hands on the wasteland. Note well, in all cases where the absolute rent, as in 2D, falls below its normal amount, because, as here, the market value is below the individual value of the class, or, as in 2B, owing to competition from the better land, a part of the capital must be withdrawn from the worse land, or whereas in 1D rent is completely absent, it is presupposed, firstly, that where rent is entirely absent, the landowner and capitalist are one and the same person. Here, therefore, the resistance of landed property against capital and the limitation of the field of action of capital by landed property disappear, but only in individual cases and as an exception. The presupposition of landed property is abolished as in the colonies, but only in separate cases. Secondly, that the competition of the better lands, or possibly the competition from the worse lands in the descending line, leads to overproduction and forcibly expands the market, creates an additional demand by forcing prices down. This, however, is the very case which Ricardo does not foresee, because he always argues on the assumption that the supply is only sufficient to satisfy the additional demand. Thirdly, the number 2 and number 1 in B, C, and D either do not pay the full amount of the absolute rent or pay no absolute rent at all, because they are forced by the competition from the better lands to sell their product below its value. Ricardo, on the other hand, presupposes that they sell their product at its value, and that the worse land always determines the market value, whereas in case 1D, which he regards as the normal case, just the opposite takes place. Furthermore, his argument is always based on the assumption of a descending line of production. If the average composition of the non-agricultural capital is 80 constant and 20 variable, and the rate of surplus value is 50%, and if the composition of the agricultural capital is 90 constant and 10 variable, i.e. higher than that of industrial capital, which is historically incorrect for capitalist production, then there is no absolute rent. If it is 80 constant and 20 variable, which has not so far been the case, there is no absolute rent. If it is lower, for instance 60 constant and 40 variable, there is an absolute rent. On the basis of the theory, the following possibilities can arise according to the relationship of the different categories to the market, i.e. depending on the extent to which one or another category dominates the market. A. The last class pays absolute rent. It determines the market value because all classes only provide the necessary supply at this market value. B. The last class determines the market value. It pays absolute rent, the full rate of rent, but not the full previous amount, because competition from 3 and 4 has forced it to withdraw part of the capital from production. C. The excess supply which classes 1, 2, 3, and 4 provide at the old market value forces the latter to fall. This, however, being regulated by the higher classes, leads to the expansion of the market. Number 1 pays only a part of the absolute rent. Number 2 pays only the absolute rent. D. The same domination of market value by the better classes, or of the inferior classes by oversupply, destroys rent in number 1 altogether, and reduces it to below its absolute amount in number 2. Finally, in E, the better classes oust number 1 from the market by bringing down the market value below the cost price of number 1. Number 2 now regulates the market value, because at this new market value, only the necessary supply is forthcoming from all 3 classes. Now back to Ricardo.